Hello, and welcome to Secular Stories, our inaugural podcast sponsored by the Secular Humanist Society of New York. Today, I am pleased to invite as a guest Dr. David Madison, and the topic of our show is Faith No More. So again, thank you for coming today, and this is the inaugural podcast. It's a pleasure to be here. Again, my guest is Dr. David Madison. I'm so used to saying Dr. David Orenstein, so I hope I don't introduce myself again. Dr. David Madison is a friend, a scholar, an activist, and I have a wonderful bio for him. David Madison was raised as in a devout Methodist home in the 1940s. His mother purchased a 12-volume Interpreter's Bible, a product of liberal Protestant scholarship. David took this 12 set onto his college career, where he worked for a PhD in biblical studies at Boston University School of Theology. But in 1975, as he was getting close to finishing his studies, he had I wouldn't necessarily call it a crisis of faith, but certainly by reading the Bible, he had become an atheist. Since that time, he was a businessman, and in 2014, published 10 Tough Problems of Christian Thought and Belief, a well-researched and very popular book. He's published 237 articles on debunking Christianity. And he's working on his next book, which is 50 Things We Wish Jesus Hadn't Said. And you're a well-respected author. You're a well-respected speaker. Could you talk to us about what it was like studying and leading a faith community?
The PhD program actually went from 1968 to 1975. So that's a 7-year period in which I had to earn a living. I was also going toward ordination, and part of the ordination process is actually leading a parish. So I actually served in 2 parishes, both of them in Massachusetts. By the time my PhD program was winding down, as you have indicated, my belief in God had pretty well evaporated. So it was quite a strain to continue to be in the parish ministry while my belief had pretty much evaporated. At that time, one of the theologians that was most popular in the world was Paul Tillich. And Tillich had said that God was the ground of all being. Well, if you're trying to hang on to something as you're still preaching, still leading the flock, so to speak, I could identify somewhat with God being the ground of all being, whatever that meant. Mm-hmm. Everybody in the congregation, of course, was showing up to worship the man upstairs, who answered prayers and who liked to have hymns sung to him. I wanted to say, people, what are you doing? What do you think you're doing? But it was such a relief to get out of that environment and move on to another career. But I did it for 9 years, and I think I did it pretty well. Just came a point where we had to say enough is enough.
Okay, so let me just circle back a little bit. Like, what was the process for you in detaching from the faith? Was it something that you read in a series of experiences that you had? Was it a combination of both? Because what I find in my own research is that people come to non-belief in 2 different ways. They either never really had a strong history with a faith tradition, or there was something that happened throughout their lives which accumulated to the point where there was a breaking of belief.
Years ago, I had a young friend, still have the friend, but he was raised in an evangelical environment in the South. And one of the common questions that these folks asked one another when they met one another, how's your walk with the Lord going today? My mother never said anything like that. She was devout, she prayed, she read the Bible. We went to church every Sunday. We said grace at all the meals, but there was never, how's your walk with the Lord going today? So I couldn't identify with that, but I still identified as a Christian. When you get to seminary, and so many of the people who go to seminary because they want to get better at being Christians. They want to be able to lead a Christian flock. But there were a few things that happened in my seminary career that made you stop short and think, wait a minute, what are we doing? For example, along with Paul Tillich, at the time I was in seminary, there was also Karl Barth, B-A-R-T-H. I don't know if many people would even recognize that name today, but at the time, Karl Barth made the cover of Time magazine. And over a 30-year period, he wrote a 14 volume theology of the Christian faith. It was called Church Dogmatics. Huge. He was Swiss. He wrote in German. And one day, one of my theology professors, tongue in cheek, being a little bit mischievous, said, nobody knows 8,000 pages about God, not even in German. And, you stop to think and say, well, wait a minute, how do we know 1 page about God? What is your source of God information? That's a challenge. Take a piece of paper, just one piece of paper, and write down everything you know for sure about God based on what? Revelation, visions, scriptures. Theists have never been able to agree on any of that stuff. Whose scripture is the real scripture? Is it the Mormons? Is it the Muslims? Is it the Catholics? Is it the Jews?
There are 2,000 denominations of Christianity alone.
30,000.
30,000.
30,000. So that was an important breaking point for me. How do we know about God? And then another important day was when a professor of mine, he was actually an Old Testament professor, and he said, what is the value of a 40-day resurrection? And what does that mean? Well, the book of Acts, chapter 1, says that after 40 days, Jesus ascended to heaven. Well, we know that didn't happen. Couldn't possibly have happened. Above our biosphere, there is just cold, radiation, pulsing vacuum. Nobody could have gone up there. That's a fable. That's a fairy tale. The body of the newly alive Jesus, if you believe in the resurrection, never left planet Earth. In other words, he died again and was buried again. So the living Lord, to guarantee eternal life, is not at this very moment sitting at the right hand of God in heaven. It's a pretty inescapable conclusion that the New Testament didn't tell the truth about what happened to Jesus at the end. It's fable. It's borrowed stories. Resurrection is a common theme in ancient cults, all the way back to the vegetation gods who were thought to die in the fall and rise in the spring. And of course, the resurrection stories in the Gospels are flawed and contradictory and contain so many improbabilities. So that key factor in Christianity, belief in the resurrection, well, if Jesus rose from the dead, what happened to that body? It had to have died again. It had to have been buried again. And then add to the mix what the Apostle Paul had to say. He didn't believe in physical body's resurrection. He said there was a spiritual body. Well, your guess is as good as mine as to what that even means. There was too much incoherence in the Christian faith. That's what drove me to abandon it. Plus, growing up in rural northern Indiana, which was as flat as it was flat to the horizon. I had a great view of the night sky. So I was very interested in astronomy. And when I got to college, I realized that I could not become an astronomer because my mathematic abilities hover close to zero. So I had to give up on that. But it was
Well,
just,
you share an allegiance with Charles Darwin
yeah,
because his degree was in theology,
yes,
but he never practiced either.
yeah, yeah. In my article last week on the Debunking Christianity blog, um, Three Pillars of My Atheism, I quote astronomer Alan Dressler, who pointed out that the scoop of the Big Dipper encloses about 1 million galaxies. He says it was just in this century, meaning he wrote in 1994, in this century, he said, we discovered our universe. And one of the things that occurred to me, we now know there are hundreds of billions of galaxies and how many trillion planets. Does it really make sense for us to be making pronouncements about God when we have not been in touch with anyone else in the cosmos? Here we are on our little rock,
On the pale blue dot.
on the pale blue dot, and we have been thinking about these things for a mere 5,000 years and have all these confident pronouncements about theology. Gosh, I'd like to talk to somebody out there who's been thinking about it and researching it for 100,000 years or more. What would they have to say about our imaginings about God? So all these things piled on together,
And that's what broke your faith, if
yeah,
you will.
yeah.
So what in terms of how this affected you maybe more directly, because a lot of people have fears of coming out as a non-believer, atheist, agnostic, humanist, whatever you call it. How did it affect your family? Did it affect your community at all?
Well, when I left the ministry, I had another job lined up, and I just didn't think it was politically correct to declare myself an atheist activist. It was traumatic enough without uh, inviting more problems. So, and I don't think I ever mentioned it to my parents. Uh, no, I never. I'm oddly enough, another thing that precipitated my departure from the ministry was acknowledging to myself that I was gay, and I kind of figured out that a gay atheist would not fit in the Methodist ministry for very long.
So that's like you and Barney Frank, right? I mean, Barney
Yeah.
Frank, it was easier for him to come out gay when he was in Congress than it was for him to come out as a non-believer.
Well, as a matter of fact, I did come out to my parents as gay, and it was a wrenching, horrendous break for a while. But my mother couldn't stand the thought of a permanent break with me, and we reconciled. And they in fact, I had moved to New York in 1978 with David Pandozzi, who is my now husband, and eventually they welcomed him into their home. So they came around.
Wonderful. So what do you think of the Roman Catholic Church? Just recently, the Pope came out and said that
The Pope came out?
the, the Pope made a pronouncement. Let me say that. Maybe eventually. But he came out with a pronouncement saying that priests cannot officiate at same-sex or same-gender weddings.
They can't bless them.
Right.
Okay.
They can't officiate.
Yeah.
Because it's apparently a sin.
Oh, the Catholic Church is so screwed up on this. I highly recommend this book. If you don't know it, if you've not seen it.
In the Closet of the Vatican. Yeah.
Yeah. Power, Homosexuality, and Hypocrisy, published by Frederic Martel. This came out 2 or 3 years ago and was simultaneously published in, I think, 6 or 7 European languages, based on 4 years of research. And the Vatican itself is mostly gay men, but they are gay men in denial. They are gay men overcome with homophobia. They go into the priesthood to try to escape their sexuality. We had the horrid examples of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, who brought their virulent homophobia to the Vatican with them. And, just they caused so much damage to human lives. It's just, the Vatican needs to get its act together. The Vatican needs to start thinking clearly on this, because their statement that homosexuality is intrinsically disordered is just crap. And the scientific community knows that. But they're stuck in their theology, as they are stuck in theology on even contraception. Every sex act has to have the potential of creating life.
Well, what is it, the Monty Python song? Every sperm is sacred, right?
Yes. Again, it's more theology that is incoherent. It doesn't.
Well, let's move on to something more enjoyable. And in particular, let's talk about 10 Tough Problems. Because this is your first book. And as I was pleased to read it, my first book was much smaller number of pages. And I think I told you that I had page envy when I saw how well organized and how well written and how the depth of your book here. Could you talk to us about this and share with our listeners and our viewers today?
My whole focus for so many years was becoming an expert, as much as an expert as one could become, in getting a PhD in biblical studies. And I wasn't able to turn that off, even as I moved into a business career. So I still kept thinking about Christianity, thinking about the Bible. And I kept making notes about, well, this doesn't make sense, this is wrong, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, after I'd retired in 2014 from my business career, I started organizing these into 10 categories. And when my book was first published, one of the most common responses I got was, "What? Only 10?" And I sweep a lot of problems into these 10 categories, but that's the way the book was organized. And it took me, I retired in 2014. I had already begun writing the book. And so I was able to focus on it pretty exclusively.
But you had been, I'm sorry for interrupting you, but you had been researching this on and off since at least 1975, right? I mean.
Well, yeah. But I don't know what year it was, 2008, 2009, 2010, I put together a reading list, a phenomenal, long reading list. And the schedule, this book I would have to read this month, this book I'll have to read this month. And finally got to the point of saying, I've got to stop reading and I've got to start writing. And that's what I finally did. You can research forever and ever and ever. But then there comes a point when you just have to sit down at the keyboard and
put it down on paper or digitally. Exactly.
And so that's what I did. I ground it out chapter by chapter, problem by problem.
Can you talk a little bit about the individual chapters and let everybody know now that the book is available on Amazon, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Kindle and paperback. The first overwhelming problem is the problem of suffering. The horrendous animal and human suffering on the planet. And there's no way really to reconcile that with the concept of a loving, caring, competent God. James A. Hout has said, he just pointed to the tsunami in 2004, 80 to 100,000 infants and toddlers drowned. How do you reconcile that with the concept of a good, competent, caring God? The second problem is the problem of knowing about God. What are the sources of reliable, verifiable, objective data about God? I moved on from there to talk specifically about how the Bible does not qualify as a divinely written document. for a whole variety of reasons. And many lay people, when they start reading the Bible, they end up saying, they're bored with it. They're horrified by it. The next chapter is on the incoherence of Christian belief. When you start out proposing that God knows everything and is all powerful, those concepts come into conflict, and people assume they say they look at nature and they say, well, how did this all get here without God? There must have been a God. The Apostle Paul kind of says much the same thing in the first chapter of his letter to the Romans. But even if you say, yes, there's a creator God, there's no way to say, well, that equals the Bible God. How do you get from one to the other?
Mm-hmm.
That takes a lot of speculation. That takes a lot of theologizing to do that. And there's not the evidence to back it up. I think in my book, I think about the options for God. You could have a God that doesn't know anything below the level of planets, doesn't even know that there's life on the planets.
Mm-hmm.
There could be a committee of gods. How about a God for every galaxy? How about an evil God?
Mm-hmm.
Christians already have that with the devil.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe he's the one in charge, and the good Christian God is the one that's second in command. So there are so many of these inconsistencies, this incoherence in Christian theology. And finally, the last chapter of part 1, chapter 5, is which monotheism?
Mm-hmm.
How do you defend? I mean, if you got Jews and Catholics and Protestants and Muslims and Mormons together in one place and said, okay, you please agree about God, it would never happen.
Right.
Simply would never happen.
So it's not only just an intra, it's an extroverted issue as well, because if there's 30,000 denominations of Christianity and there's multiple denominations of Judaism and you've got Sunni and Shia, you keep going down this rabbit hole of interpretation, which itself is another word for bias. And what that means is that anyone can be correct, but that means that everyone can be incorrect. And if you go from a statement like there, you realize that the whole construct of divination is itself comes from a place, whether it be psychological or sociological or historical, point of fear and fallacy and power, and more about attempting to, find out something that the tools that the questions that are being asked, even if a theist and an atheist ask the same questions, the theist only has 2 or 3 tools in their toolbox, where a non-believer has all of the scientific theory and instruments of science to be able to answer those same questions about why are we here, or, how did we get here, and so on and so forth. The short answer is always God did it. And if you do that, you'll never know anything. But if you look at science and the complexity and all we're learning about our time on this planet and the universe's space as well, you realize that it is much more complex, but it is, to our ability, knowable using science to define the concept of good and evil, using the concept of ethics, empathy, how and who we should treat well, which is pretty much everyone if you take the humanistic point of view. And so there's a lot you can, which your book definitely turns itself onto by saying, look at all these issues that you find in the faith of 2.4 billion people on the planet that we could easily dismiss because there's no reason or logic to it. Let's move on a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about the Clergy Project?
This was founded, I believe, the brainchild of Daniel Dennett and Richard Dawkins, because so many clergy themselves, I'm not the only one, by the way, but the Clergy Project was founded to be an online support group for clergy who have become atheists. And it doesn't matter if you're Muslim or Mormon or Jewish or Christians. This is a place to go. There's an interview process to be accepted to the Clergy Project. It has a website where the members of the project can go on to share their problems and their agonies. And many of the clergy who are atheists are still serving churches. Still, they still have their congregations. And like myself, after all this time getting a bachelor's degree in political science, undergraduate, and then getting a bachelor's degree in sacred theology, which I'm now advised has been converted to a master's degree, which it should have been at the time, and then getting a PhD in biblical studies. What do you do with that in the business world? Who cares? So when I went in to change careers, my first year, one of my parishioners worked for New York Life, and he thought I'd make a good insurance salesman. And I did for a year. He was influential in getting me hired by New York Life. I hated it, but I did sell more than $1 million worth of insurance. The old Woody Allen line about there's no fate worse than spending an evening with a life insurance salesman. And I was a salesman, and I felt that way myself. But when I moved to New York with David in 1978, I lucked out and got into a human resources related position, personnel agency, which also basically was sales. You're selling candidates to institutions.
You were essentially a headhunter, is that correct?
Well, there were headhunters in that world, but we didn't. We got the people we needed by advertising in the New York Times. But then we tried to sell these candidates who came to us. We interviewed them. We tried to understand them as thoroughly as possible, and then try to get them placed at institutions. But the last 15 years of my career, I was hired by an outplacement firm and I was the head of the Association of Career Coaches. So that was the way I closed out my business career.
You've mentioned David a few times. Could you? I know some of the story, but could you tell how you met the love of your life and how long you guys have been married?
We've been together for 42 years, and dare I admit it, we met at church. This is back.
Finally, a reason to go to church, everyone.
1976. At that time, there was a church called Metropolitan Community Church. I believe that was its name. And it was founded by Troy Perry specifically for gay and lesbian Christians. And they would find, they never built a church, physical building, but they could find congregations that were willing to rent space to them for their worship services. So I was in central Massachusetts. David was in Rhode Island, so I was invited to be guest preacher at the Metropolitan Community Church in Providence, and that's where we met. And he was in the process of, I got him on the rebound because he was breaking up with his boyfriend, and the rest is history. By 1978, we decided to move to New York together. We moved into the same apartment, 1978, and we're still in the same apartment. Can't beat rent control.
I can tell your bookshelves are getting really packed. You might have to.
I have to use Kindle now. I don't have space for more books. But in 2008, there was a brief period when marriage was legal in California. And in 2008, we flew to California to get married. And then, that was in September 2008. And then in November, Proposition 8 was passed, prohibiting gay marriage.
Mm.
Strong, strong, strong backing from the Mormon Church, by the way. But then 3 years later, marriage equality was passed here in New York, and so we were married there in California in 2008, and then here in Manhattan in 2011. So,
and these laws are so subjective because they're really religiously based. There's no reason. I mean, if you look at it from a constitutional point of view, it's clear that people who are in love should be allowed to marry. Period. There should be no daylight beyond that statement. And so anything that stops, people who are in love from getting married usually comes from the point of view of some aspect of theology.
Let me interject here. My father was a doctor, and I found on his shelf Kenzie's Sexuality in the Human Male, which was published in the late 1940s. And I knew when I was a kid what I was. And so I read his sections, the Kenzie sections on homosexuality. And it was just an invariable part of human nature that I think he estimated something like 4 to 5%.
Let me just, if I may, and I want you to continue, but it's not just human nature. It's nature that what we consider, we define or categorize as quote unquote homosexuality occurs across species on the planet. So please go on.
But so I knew even as a child it was not something that was, well, statistically it's abnormal because most people are not that way, but it was a fact of nature. But I grew up in rural northern Indiana in the 1940s and 1950s where Christianity was the rule. And so I had no role models. There was no Ellen DeGeneres. There was no Neil Patrick Harris to show this is the way some people work it out. So I followed the script and I got married to a woman. That marriage fell apart after 10 years because it just wasn't who I was. So, there's no, it's a faith-based bias that has seeped into the law.
Right.
There's no doubt about that.
Let me ask you, if you wouldn't mind talking about a little bit of the relationship with your daughter.
That's interesting. As a matter of fact, when we went to California to get married in 2008, she helped officiate at the ceremony because she also is an atheist and has no tolerance for homophobia of any kind. So she's been a great champion, a great support.
Wonderful.
It's a very rewarding thing to have.
Super. Hey, could you talk a little bit about your new book that's coming out? Because that's very exciting too.
Well, the ninth tough problem in 10 Tough Problems is what a friend we don't have in Jesus. There's so much hype about Jesus. What would Jesus do? If you read the Gospels carefully with as little faith bias as possible, there's so much. Well, I've come up with the working title, 50 Things We Wish Jesus Hadn't Said. But I went through the Gospels.
Share a couple of those things?
Sure. I went through the Gospels word by word, line by line for the umpteenth time in my 78 years. And I built an Excel spreadsheet of things we wish Jesus hadn't said. And the total came to, I think it was 259. And Christians say, what are you talking about? Jesus was the greatest moral teacher ever. 2 or 3 years ago, I fell into casual conversation with a Catholic woman, and she was talking about, oh, wonderful Lord Jesus this and wonderful Lord Jesus that. And my tendency to be mischievous kicked in. And I asked her, I said, well, what about Luke 14:26, where Jesus says you have to hate your family, father, mother, sons, daughters, in order to be a disciple? She got very angry with me. She thought I was lying. There could be no such verse.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yes, there is. And Christians go through all sorts of contortions to say, oh, well, Jesus couldn't have meant that, because they have this ideal Jesus of the imagination that has been drummed into them for decades by priests and preachers. Jesus couldn't have meant that.
Or it's the cherry picking, right? Or it's the cherry picking, because, if you look at what the Bible says about women or what the Bible says about slavery, there's nothing in it that says God said don't keep slaves, or slavery is immoral or unethical. There's nothing that says Jesus never brought it up. In fact, there's portions of the Bible in both the Old and the New Testament that laud slavery, that say, slaves obey your masters, so there's no, if you're using the Bible as a form of ethics, you realize that in itself is infallibility.
Well, or God kind of flubbed his great opportunity with Charlton Heston. Moses. God flubbed the Ten Commandments. No prohibition of slavery. No prohibition of war. No prohibition of racism. No prohibition of homophobia. These big sins that have plagued humanity forever.
No prohibition of misogyny, violence against children.
But on the Luke 14:26, people look at that and say, Jesus couldn't have meant that. And my rejoinder is, my comeback is, if you are an expert on ancient Aramaic and Greek, I will listen to you. That you have figured out what Jesus meant by that. Hector Avalos, in his book, The Bad Jesus, has a 39-page chapter on just this verse. And it means exactly what it seems to mean. The word hate is right there.
And you're looking at this from the point of view of that apparently Jesus never wrote anything down, right? Everything is hearsay. The Bible, the Bible itself was not even codified, for hundreds of years.
In my introduction, I talk about this very issue. I say, let's take these words of Jesus at face value, because that's what most Christians want to do. There it is, the Bible, look it up. Jesus said it. It's in red print. We know Jesus said it. And that's the premise I go with on this book. Okay, let's take these as the words of Jesus and see where that gets you. And it gets you into a big mess. But in the introduction, I explain exactly why these are not the words of Jesus and cannot possibly be the words of Jesus. I discussed that in the introduction. But there are 4 categories of bad Jesus sayings. Apocalypticism. There's a strain of apocalyptic belief in the teaching of Jesus,
which the evangelicals absolutely love, by the way.
Of course.
Yeah.
But Jesus says, as his trial in the Gospel of Mark, he tells those at his trial, you will see me coming on the clouds of heaven. Didn't happen. The second category of bad Jesus sayings is cult fanaticism, such as, you've got to hate your family to be one of my followers. If you want to say Jesus never could have said that, then you have to ask, why would Luke say that he said it? Luke was an advocate for the early Jesus cult. They didn't want people who were lukewarm. They didn't want people with divided loyalties.
So Luke didn't want anyone to be lukewarm. I love that.
The third category is bad advice and bad theology. And the primary example I give of that is Jesus' teaching on divorce. Those who God has joined together, let no one put asunder. That's really bad theology. Do you mean of all the marriages that have taken place since post-Neanderthal days, every marriage that has ever happened God joined those people together. We know how many horrible, bad marriages there have been. So God joined all those people together. It's bad theology. Uh,
Okay, David, thank you. I mean, you have been wonderful. I want to leave a little time for Q&A, and we've been going for
okay.
about 45 minutes now.
Oh my
Let me
gosh.
just ask, because I had a list of about almost 20 questions, and we didn't get to all of them, but you've been absolutely delightful. Um, you're an atheist, you're an author, you're an activist, you're a philosopher. Of all of these titles, which do you feel gives you the most pleasure?
Um, the author part. I mean, I've written 237 articles for the Debunking Christianity blog. I'm working on a new book. I love being the author because it stimulates me. It forces me to learn more, to study more, to keep studying, to keep learning. Uh, so that's certainly satisfying. But then uh, activist or advocate, whatever word you want to
Mm-hmm.
use, um, getting these thoughts out there on the internet in the Debunking Christianity blog is important. I have my
Mm-hmm.
own YouTube channel, which now has more than 100 videos on it on a
Mm-hmm.
variety of topics. Um, I try to limit each one to 5 minutes each, just to make it easier to take. That also gives me a great deal of satisfaction. I'm also very active on Twitter. Very early on, after the book was published, there was a person who had made a few memes of things I had said in the book. And that really sparked my interest. I said, wait a minute, memes. And so to date, I have created more than 600 memes based on quotes, not just from my own writings, but quotes from other atheist authors, such as yourself.
You've memed me exactly.
So my goal is to create 1,000 of these.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then I put them onto in numerical order. I put them onto Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I also have a series of memes called Essential Titles in the Cure for Christianity library. Um, my publisher would not allow a bibliography in the book.
Mm.
He said it was too long, and so I was disappointed. But then I thought, wait a minute, I can put the bibliography on my book's website. And that allows me to expand it as I come across new titles. And it was Mark Twain who said, the best cure for Christianity is reading the Bible. So that's why I call it the Cure for Christianity Library. So to date, I've created maybe 80 titles of atheist books that I call essential titles in the Cure for Christianity Library. And I put those up on Twitter as well. So,
Well, I know you as a friend, and I know you as a scholar, and I can tell everybody who's listening now and who will listen in the future that your research is meticulous. I respect how you go about doing your research like no other scholar that I've ever met almost. I mean, you are so detailed focused and so interested in the truth that I just find your work amazing. And it shows that, you can start writing, right? You can think for decades, but to get it out and now to be so productive at a time when a lot of people slow down, you seem to be speeding up, and I just really want you to know that that I respect your work and everything that you've done for the atheist and humanist movement as well.
I will say this, writing style is important. And I do not believe in a stuffy academic writing style.
Mm-hmm.
I use first person, I use contractions, I use slang. I aim for a conversational style so people can pick up my books or the Debunking Christianity blog and feel
Mm-hmm.
like they're talking to somebody
Right.
instead
Right.
of instead of attending a professorial lecture.
Right. Beautiful. Okay, so David, I do want to thank you for talking with us today.
Okay, been a
I
pleasure.
appreciate it very much, and I can think of no better person to have as our first guest on our maiden voyage into the land of podcast. And I'll open up. We have two Larrys with us, one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast. So if they have any questions, I'll open up now.
Yeah, hey, thanks a lot for this. This has been really nice. I have a question. You have the voluminous publications, David, Madison, the voluminous publications, but in your more informal discussions or activism, have you found a particular way of talking with people of faith that maybe are otherwise intelligent, let's say, okay, but is there a way of talking to get them to question their faith in an effective way? You know? We have like a manual for creating atheists with the so-called street epistemology and Socratic method. But have you found a particular way of discussing with people?
I admit that's a tough one. In the first couple of years after my book was published, I would do a paid boost for it on Facebook every weekend. You know, plop down $30 and you choose the audience. And the audience I chose was humanism, atheists, et cetera, but inevitably Christians, it would end up on their news feed. And it was amazing the level of hate and anger that I would even dare to question the validity of their faith. And I found that very chilling. I'm not an expert on that. I'm not good at dialoguing with individual Christians. I put my work out there. If they come across it, if it has an impact, then I'm happy with that. But I've had very little interaction with one-on-one with individual Christians.
So much for love thy neighbor. Huh?
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Larry, the other Larry from East, we'll call him East Coast Larry.
I was in a writing group, an atheist writing group a few years ago with David Madison, and I can contest, I read his book. He's an excellent writer, and he was very tough on me in the writers group. He was really very critical. And the consequence is that he taught me how to write. And I will always be indebted to you, David, for that. And I really thank you very much for your effort that you made to point out when I didn't know. And I'm now, a novel of mine is in the process of being prepared for publishing.
Wow,
So,
great for you.
so I'm very thankful for that.
By the way, I acknowledge you as a part of the writers group in my book.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm flattered. But you're an excellent teacher, really a fine teacher, tough teacher, but a fine one. And the thing about that I saw in your book is you're pointing out the ridiculousness of Christian theology. Well, it's ridiculous. Yes, it's ridiculous in this way. And I think that one point you may be missing is that to people who are religious, they don't care.
No.
It's like the bulk of the people who are the Trump supporters who wear the MAGA hats. Trump is part of a cult, and it's no accident that most of them are religious Christians, evangelical Christians. They don't care. I mean, you'll say, "I love Trump." Boy, what did he do to you? He got a tax break for the super rich. How did that help the average Trump supporter? The average Trump supporter wasn't helped one whit from Trump, but he believes in Trump because that's his God. Just as he believes in Jesus and the New Testament. I believe in this. I want to believe in it. And I don't care about the facts. And that's why you may have a problem that you're saying, well, look, this is ridiculous. And this is the reason why it's ridiculous. And they don't care.
Mm.
They just, it doesn't matter to them. Which is why I maintain that show me a religious Christian, I'll show you a borderline psychopath.
Well, I have to say that sometimes we can get through to even very devout Christians, because life happens. Life happens.
Good point. Good point.
And whether it's, Stephen Fry, when he was asked what he would say to God if he found himself at the pearly gates, he said, I would ask God, bone cancer in children? What is that about? How dare you? And so when people go through these crises, how many parents who lost children in school shootings have to stop and say, wait a minute, the good God I've been taught to believe in, that doesn't make sense. What could God have done to have prevented the shooting?
But what do you say? What I heard a minister saying, he was a very respected religious leader, and he said, we cannot understand why these things happen. They happen for a good purpose, but we can't understand it because God has infinite intelligence. How do you argue with that?
Well, I think that the issue is that it's not we, it's the person saying that. Because we know, living in the real world, in the material universe, why these things are happening. We understand the corrupt nature of many of the fallacies that we have, and that the violence is easy to deal with if we were to communally decide to deal with it and not deal with it afterwards by putting people in jail. Like, common sense gun control. These are things that could really prevent things like this. Better mental health screening. If you look at it from the Hitchens point of view, right, which I think, Larry, you're sort of getting to, is like the Mother Teresa would say, there's a lot of pain and suffering in this world. Absorb the pain and suffering of this world, because in your next life, the virtue of the pain and suffering is that you'll go into heaven. And so, sure, this world is tough, but there's a reward at the end. Well, for people like us, there is no reward at the end other than the end. And so it's us to make it better. And to Larry Parris's point, you may not be able to, let's say you're at Thanksgiving dinner, and I may have made this point with you before, and you're with Uncle Fred, who's a evangelical or, whatever, true believer, regardless. You might not be able to change Uncle Fred, but does Uncle Fred have children? Because if in your actions and your beliefs, if you can get to Uncle Fred's children and show Uncle Fred that there are other ways of being, you'll probably have more of an impact on people who are so locked in that they can't change for whatever psychological or demographic reason. But if you can get to the youth, as Thomas Aquinas said, get to the youth and give me a boy at 5 and I'll turn him into a Christian at 20. We can do the same. I'm sorry?
It was the Jesuits.
The Jesuits, yes.
Their motto.
Yeah, I'm sorry, wrong person. But we could do the same thing with people leading them to reason. We can't probably change Uncle Fred, but we can change Uncle Fred's kids.
Well, I think that's the reason why the nuns have been increasing in number.
Absolutely.
Since the year 2000, well more than 400 new books have come out. Mm-hmm. Not just Dawkins and Hitchens and the original New Atheists, mm-hmm. but you, David, me, and more than 400 other authors. Our books are out there. Mm-hmm. And I think they're having some impact.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming. I especially want to thank David Madison for his time and attention today. David, it's always so lovely and a pleasure to talk with you. And I hope once COVID is over, that I'll have a chance to share some wine with you and your husband. To the two Larrys, I thank you, of course, for participating, and to my co-producer, Carl Marxer, for his wonderful support and graciousness as well. I thank you, and thanks for stopping by.
Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Come on. Thank you. Thank you.